I used my grandmother's $40,000 to send my best friend to luxury rehab, then found out she'd been selling pills to my other best friend since her brother's funeral. When I confronted her, she hugged me and whispered, "Take care of Stella for me. She'll fall apart faster than you can imagine." I just stood there. That was 17 weeks ago. This morning, she was led out of her house in handcuffs, screaming my name. What choice will haunt you for the rest of your life? I was 17 when I realized I had enough money to save exactly one of my best friends from dying. My grandmother had left me $40,000 to start my life, but my dreams seemed trivial when both Ruby and Stella were on the brink of death from substance use disorder. The rehab facility in Switzerland cost $38,000 for the 3-month program that actually worked. I could send one of them, but only one, and I somehow had to pick. Ruby and Stella had been my everything since 7th grade when we all got detention for sneaking into the teacher's lounge. We called ourselves a three-headed monster because you never saw one without the others. In high school, both their lives fell apart. Stella's brother died in a car accident, and Ruby's mom abandoned the family for her personal trainer. They both started using around the same time, but Ruby was first, and her deterioration was so much faster and more terrifying. She lost 30 pounds in 2 months and aged overnight. Her parents kicked her out after she stole her little sister's birthday money, and she was living with random people, making money in ways she'd never revealed to me. In college, I found her unconscious in her bathtub with the water still running and her lips turning blue. The paramedics brought her back, but barely, and they said next time would be the last. Stella and I clutched each other in the waiting room while Ruby got her stomach pumped, both of us crying so hard we couldn't speak. But Stella was high the whole time too. She always was by that point. Stella's decline was quieter, but still terrifying because she was disappearing piece by piece. She took pills that made her float through life like a ghost. Her mom would call me begging to know if she was still alive. Unlike Ruby's chaos, Stella would sit perfectly still for hours staring at nothing. She kept saying she needed to not feel anything because her brother would never feel anything ever again. The rehab counselor was brutally honest when I called her for advice on who to send. "You're playing God with a checkbook, and one of them is going to die because you can't afford to save them both," she said, like she was discussing the weather. I spent every night that week going between their apartments, trying to figure out who needed saving more desperately. The counselor said to choose whoever was more likely to complete the program successfully. I made my choice when Ruby grabbed my hand after another emergency room visit and said, "When I die, please make sure Stella doesn't blame herself because none of this was ever about her." That's when I realized Ruby had already given up, and maybe saving her would prove someone still believed she was worth fighting for. Stella had support and family. Ruby had nothing except me. I told Ruby about the program, and she stared at me for the longest time before nodding silently. We flew to Switzerland 3 days later, and I stayed to help her check in. Before going through security for the treatment wing, Ruby hugged me and whispered something strange. "Take care of Stella for me because without me around, she's going to fall apart faster than you can imagine." After Ruby's plane took off, I drove straight to Stella's house to check on her and explain we'd find her treatment too. I found her in her bedroom sobbing harder than I'd ever seen, her whole body shaking as she clutched her pillow. I tried to hold her, but she pushed me away, crying that she didn't know what she was going to do now. "Ruby's gone, and I don't know how I'm going to get my stuff anymore because she was the only one who would sell to me without telling my parents," she choked out between sobs. My blood turned to ice water as she continued. "She's the one who gave me my first pills after my brother died because she said they would help with the pain, and then she kept giving me stronger ones and charging me more money until I couldn't stop." I sat there frozen while Stella revealed how Ruby had been her supplier for 2 years, carefully controlling what she took and how much she could have, making sure she stayed hooked but never had enough. Ruby would pretend to be worried about Stella in front of me while secretly meeting her behind the mall to sell her pills that got stronger every month. The room started spinning as I realized I'd just spent my grandmother's entire inheritance to send the dealer to luxury rehab while her victim sat here dying. I'd saved the person who destroyed Stella's life, and now Stella was going to die because of my choice. Stella sobbed, "She got me addicted on purpose, and you chose her over me." The room kept spinning while Stella collapsed onto her bed and grabbed her pillow so hard her knuckles went white. She was shaking and crying about how Ruby approached her at her brother's funeral with pills that would help with the pain. My legs wouldn't move, and my brain couldn't process that I'd just sent Ruby to Switzerland with my grandmother's money, while Stella sat here dying from the drugs Ruby sold her. Stella kept sobbing about how Ruby controlled everything she took and made her pay more every month until she couldn't stop even if she wanted to. My stomach turned, and I stumbled toward the bathroom just as bile rose in my throat. I barely made it to the toilet before everything came up while Stella's words kept echoing in my head about Ruby being her dealer for 2 whole years. Through the door, I heard car keys jingling and then Linda's voice asking why Stella was crying so hard. Their muffled conversation made my stomach turn again, and I gripped the toilet seat while more came up. The bathroom door flew open, and Linda stood there staring at me hunched over the toilet with vomit on my chin. She grabbed my shoulders asking what was happening, and when I told her Ruby left for Switzerland and was actually Stella's dealer, her face went completely white. She shook me hard, asking how I could have been so blind when all the signs were right there. We ended up in the living room where Stella explained through tears how the prices kept going up, and Ruby threatened to tell her parents if she tried to quit. Linda held her daughter while they both shook, and I stared at the carpet, unable to look at either of them. That night, I lay in my childhood bed replaying every single interaction between Ruby and Stella over the past 2 years. Ruby always knew where Stella was, and insisted on driving her places alone, and her concern always seemed just a little bit fake. Small moments suddenly made sense, like Ruby texting Stella constantly, and getting mad when Stella tried to hang out with other people. The next morning, I called Dr. Reeves at the Swiss facility to explain what I'd learned about Ruby dealing to Stella. She listened without saying anything, then told me Ruby checked in yesterday, and already charmed the whole staff with her brave survivor story. The program had started, and they couldn't refund the money no matter what Ruby had done before arriving. I drove to Ruby's parents' house, desperate for some kind of answer that would make this make sense. Her dad answered the door looking exhausted with dark circles under his eyes. When I told him about Ruby dealing to Stella, he just nodded and said they suspected she was selling, but thought getting clean would make it all stop. Joy appeared in the hallway, still wearing her school uniform, even though it was Saturday morning. She looked older than 14 with that worn-down look kids get when their family falls apart. She said Ruby took her birthday money to buy pills to sell, and she saw the texts on Ruby's phone about supplying half their school. I sat in my car outside their house and called my mom to tell her everything that had happened. She listened without saying anything, nothing, then said she was coming home from work right away. Her voice made me cry for the first time since finding out the truth about Ruby and Stella. That afternoon, Brian showed up at my house looking like he'd aged 10 years since his son died. He thanked me for trying to help even though I chose wrong and said we needed to focus on saving Stella now because that's all that mattered. That night, Linda called me screaming that Stella was having seizures and the ambulance was taking her to the hospital. I drove there so fast I don't remember most of the trip. The emergency room doctor explained that without Ruby's steady supply of pills, Stella's body was shutting down from withdrawal. Her brain couldn't handle the sudden absence of chemicals it had depended on for 2 years. They needed to start medical detox immediately, but our insurance wouldn't cover it because technically she wasn't dying yet, just having seizures every few hours. The treatment would cost $12,000 up front. I had $2,000 left from my grandmother's money after buying Ruby's plane ticket. Linda sat in the waiting room chair rocking back and forth while Brian paced the hallway on his phone trying to find any way to get the money. 2 days later, I created a GoFundMe page and wrote everything about how Ruby had gotten Stella addicted on purpose and how I'd made the worst choice of my life sending the dealer to rehab instead of the victim. Within hours, kids from our school started sharing it with their own stories about Ruby. Someone wrote about buying pills in the bathroom during lunch. Another person described how Ruby threatened to tell their parents about their drug use if they didn't pay double. The stories kept coming, each one worse than the last. People talked about Ruby raising prices every week, making them steal from their families, forcing them to bring her new customers. I drove back to the hospital where Stella was hooked up to IVs with her skin looking gray and wet. She grabbed my hand with fingers that felt like ice and whispered that Ruby had videos of her doing things when she was too high to remember. How did Ruby manage to hide being a dealer from everyone for so long while pretending to care about Stella? The way she controlled the supply and kept raising prices sounds like she had a whole system planned out perfectly. Ruby said she'd post them online if Stella ever told anyone about the pills. My whole body went cold listening to her describe the blackmail Ruby had been holding over her for months. The next day, Detective Sarah Walsh showed up at the hospital after someone sent her the GoFundMe page. She'd been trying to build a case against Ruby for over a year, but nobody would testify because they were all too scared. She sat next to Stella's bed with a recorder and took down everything about the 2 years of dealing and manipulation. Stella could barely stay awake, but she told Sarah about the prices, the threats, the way Ruby controlled exactly how much she could have to keep her desperate but functional. A week later, I walked into school alone for the first time since 7th grade. The hallways felt wrong without Ruby and Stella beside me. People stared and whispered everywhere I went. Some kids came up to tell me their own Ruby stories, but others blamed me for sending her away right when the police were finally building a case. During lunch, Joy texted me screenshots from Ruby's old phone she'd found hidden in their garage. There were spreadsheets with names and prices, notes about which kids to target based on their family problems, threats to expose secrets if anyone stopped paying. One column was labeled insurance with video file names next to people's names. Stella's name appeared at least 20 times. That afternoon, Sarah called an emergency meeting at the police station. Ruby had somehow gotten a phone in the Swiss rehab center and was contacting all her former customers. She was telling them to delete everything and stay quiet, or she'd release the videos she had. 3 kids had already taken back their statements to the police. Sarah said Ruby was threatening everyone from across the ocean, still controlling them even from rehab. Brian and Linda invited me to their house for dinner to talk about what to do next. We sat around their kitchen table with food nobody touched while Brian talked about maybe taking out another mortgage on their house. They were already underwater from their son's funeral costs, but Brian said losing the house would be worth it if it saved Stella. Linda started crying into her hands, saying she couldn't lose both her children. Over the next 2 weeks, the GoFundMe slowly climbed to $8,000. Messages poured in from parents who had no idea their kids were buying from Ruby. Teachers wrote about noticing changes in students but being told by administration not to make trouble. Even the school janitor donated and said he'd been finding pills in the bathrooms for months, but was told to stay quiet about it. I checked on Stella every single day using the spare key Linda had given me. She was staying at their house now, too weak to be alone. That morning, I found her on her bedroom floor with an empty bottle of her mom's sleeping pills next to her. Her lips were turning blue and she wasn't breathing right. I called 911 while trying to remember CPR from health class. The paramedics got there in 4 minutes, but it felt like hours. They worked on her for so long, I thought she was gone. They finally got her breathing again and rushed her to the hospital. Linda collapsed in the hospital hallway when she arrived, screaming that she couldn't lose both her children, hitting the floor with her fists while nurses tried to calm her down. The nurses got Linda into a wheelchair and took her to a quiet room while the doctors worked on stabilizing Stella. I sat in the waiting room for 6 hours watching families come and go, some crying, some laughing, all of them together while I was completely alone with what I'd done. My phone rang around midnight and Dr. Reeves's voice came through clear from Switzerland, telling me Ruby had been caught with a hidden phone and a bag of pills she'd somehow gotten from another patient. Instead of kicking her out like they should have, Ruby had convinced the staff she was being persecuted back home and needed more support, so they were waiving the extra fees for extended treatment while keeping her there even longer. I hung up feeling sick to my stomach, knowing Ruby was playing them just like she'd played me. 2 nights later at 2 a.m., someone started pounding on my front door so hard the whole house shook. Joy stood there in the rain with a huge backpack, her face red and angry, telling me she'd run away and stolen everything from Ruby's hiding spots in their house. She dumped USB drives, notebooks, and another phone onto my kitchen table, saying she wanted her sister to pay for what she'd done to everyone. I called Detective Walsh right away, and she came over with 2 other officers who started going through everything Joy had brought. The USB drives had videos of at least 30 kids from our school doing things they'd never want anyone to see, and Ruby had labeled each file with the person's name and what she could get from them. Most of the videos showed kids passed out or doing drugs, but there were dozens of Stella, almost all taken while she was unconscious in different places. Sarah's team spent the next week cataloging everything, finding proof that Ruby had been building this blackmail collection for years before she even started dealing drugs. 3 weeks after Ruby left for Switzerland, I finally got permission to visit Stella in the psychiatric ward, where they'd moved her after her suicide attempt. She looked so small in the hospital bed, her arms wrapped in bandages, apologizing over and over for not telling me about Ruby sooner. She whispered that she thought if she just kept paying Ruby enough money, Ruby would eventually let her go, but it just got worse and worse until she couldn't see any way out except to end everything. The next day, the school board called an emergency meeting after Sarah's Sarah's investigation went public and parents started showing up at the school demanding answers. The auditorium was packed with screaming parents wanting to know how Ruby had operated for years without anyone stopping her. The principal stood at the podium admitting they'd suspected something, but didn't want to ruin a young girl's future without solid proof, which made 3 families immediately announce they were suing the district for negligence. A month after Ruby left, Sarah discovered something even worse when 2 14-year-olds got caught selling pills at the middle school, with instructions they said came directly from Ruby. She'd been running her whole operation from the rehab facility through a network of younger kids she'd recruited before leaving, using the contraband phone to send orders and threats to keep everyone in line through fear and blackmail. I spent my nights going through old photos of the 3 of us, looking for signs I should have seen, and in every picture from the last 2 years, Ruby had her hand on Stella's shoulder or arm, not like a friend, but like she owned her. The way Ruby always positioned herself between Stella and everyone else, the way she'd whisper in Stella's ear at parties, the way Stella would flinch when Ruby touched her, it was all there, and I'd been too stupid to see it. I was at the grocery store buying food for dinner when Brian found me in the cereal aisle and started yelling that I should have known what Ruby was doing to his daughter. Other shoppers stopped and stared as he broke down crying right there next to the Cheerios, saying he'd already lost his son, and now he was losing Stella too because I chose to save the person who destroyed her instead of the victim who needed help. His wife had to come get him because he couldn't stop sobbing, and I just stood there holding a box of cereal feeling like the worst person alive. Joy ended up staying with my family after her parents said they couldn't handle her anger toward Ruby anymore, and at dinner one night she told us Ruby used to practice crying in the mirror, timing how long it took people to comfort her. She'd test different sob stories on Joy to see which ones worked best, keeping notes about what made people feel the most guilty so she could use it later to manipulate them. The worst part came when the GoFundMe we'd set up for Stella's treatment got frozen because Ruby's parents' lawyer claimed we were defaming their daughter who was getting help for her addiction. $13,000 sat there untouchable while Stella got worse in the psychiatric ward, and then Linda called me sobbing because insurance wouldn't cover any more days, so they were releasing Stella tomorrow even though she was nowhere near ready to come home. 5 weeks after Ruby left for Switzerland, I stood outside the hospital entrance watching Linda help Stella into their car while Brian loaded her bag in the trunk. Stella looked so small in the passenger seat, her hands shaking as she tried to buckle the seatbelt, and Linda kept touching her shoulder like she was checking if she was still real. I followed them in my car because Linda asked me to stay close in case Stella needed anything on the way home. We were halfway through the parking lot when a guy I recognized from school, one of the kids who used to hang around Ruby's locker, walked straight up to their car at the stop sign. He knocked on Stella's window and she rolled it down before Linda could stop her, and I watched him slip something into her hand while saying something I couldn't hear. Linda started screaming at him, but he was already jogging away, and by the time I got out of my car, Stella had already swallowed whatever pills he gave her. Brian grabbed her shoulders asking what she took, but her eyes were already rolling back, and Linda was crying so hard she couldn't dial 911, so I had to do it while Brian carried Stella back toward the emergency room entrance. The same doctors who just released her were suddenly running toward us with a gurney, and one of them kept saying, not again, as they wheeled her away. Ruby kept running her drug business from inside the Swiss rehab center. The way she got a secret phone and pills from another patient shows she never stopped planning things. Her skin was turning this awful yellow color, and the doctor told us her liver was shutting down from whatever she took mixed with all the damage from before. They moved her straight to the ICU and put her on machines that were supposed to clean her blood because her liver couldn't do it anymore. Detective Sarah showed up 3 hours later with papers for Ruby's extradition that she'd finally gotten approved, but when she called the facility in Switzerland, they said they couldn't release a patient in critical treatment because it would violate medical ethics. The rehab director told Sarah that Ruby was in the middle of intensive therapy, and removing her could cause psychological damage that would set back her recovery by months. Sarah threw her phone against the wall after that call, then sat down and explained that the international legal process could take years because Switzerland had different laws about medical privacy and patient rights. 3 days later, I was in my therapist's office, the one I'd started seeing twice a week because I couldn't sleep anymore, when she asked me if I'd ever considered that Ruby picked me on purpose. She pointed out that Ruby knew about my grandmother's money before she died, knew I was the kind of person who would feel responsible for saving someone, and knew exactly what to say to make me believe she was the victim. The manipulation started way before the inheritance, my therapist said, with Ruby testing how much I would do for her, how much guilt I would carry, how easily I could be convinced to take her side. That same week, 3 kids from our school tried to kill themselves after videos of them started showing up online, the same videos Ruby had been using for blackmail before she left. Their parents filled the police station demanding answers, and Sarah had to explain over and over that prosecuting someone in a Swiss medical facility was basically impossible because of jurisdiction issues. One father threw a chair through the window and had to be arrested, while a mother just sat on the floor sobbing about how her daughter might never wake up. Linda moved out of their house the next week, telling Brian she couldn't look at him anymore because he reminded her of everything they'd failed to do for Stella. She went to stay with her sister across town while Brian started sleeping in the hospital waiting room, bringing changes of clothes in a gym bag, and showering in the patient family facilities. They wouldn't even text each other directly anymore, just sent messages through me about Stella's condition and medical decisions. Joy called me crying one night because Ruby had been messaging her on Instagram from a secret account, sending photos of Joy that she'd taken without her knowing over the years. The messages said Joy betrayed family by cooperating with the police and would pay for choosing wrong, with captions under the photos describing what Ruby would do when she got back. Joy showed me dozens of messages that got worse every day, including photos from inside Joy's bedroom that Ruby must have taken months ago while Joy was sleeping. 2 days after that, I got my own email from Ruby, this long message about how hurt she was that I believed Stella's lies and turned everyone against her. She wrote about finding herself in rehab, healing from the trauma of being falsely accused, discovering her true purpose through meditation and group therapy. The whole thing read like she actually believed she was the victim, like she'd convinced herself that everything that happened was someone else's fault. Meanwhile, our whole town was trying to help the families Ruby had destroyed, with churches organizing meal trains and a retired lawyer offering free help with the frozen GoFundMe money. The school janitor who'd found pills in Ruby's locker started a support group for parents, meeting every Tuesday in the gym to share resources and information about treatment programs. But none of that helped Stella, whose liver was failing more every day according according to the tests they kept running. The doctor said she needed a transplant, but her history of substance abuse put her at the bottom of the list. And even if they found a liver, there was no guarantee her body could handle the surgery. Brian got tested to donate part of his liver, but the blood work showed he wasn't a match. And when Linda got tested, she found out she had hepatitis B from a blood transfusion after a car accident years ago. The transplant coordinator said we were running out of time and started looking for other family members who might match, but Stella didn't have siblings and her cousins lived in other states. 7 weeks after Ruby left, I was sitting in the ICU with Brian when Dr. Reeves called from Switzerland to give me an update. Ruby had completed the first phase of treatment and was being praised as a model patient who was really committed to her recovery. She was even counseling other patients now, sharing her story of survival and inspiring them to keep fighting their addictions. And Dr. Reeves said she'd never seen someone make such remarkable progress. I threw up in the hospital bathroom after that call, then went back to watching Stella's machines beep while her skin got more yellow every day. 2 days later, Detective Walsh called me at the hospital to say the FBI was taking over Ruby's case because they'd found kids from Washington and California in her videos, and Agent Diana Morrison promised she could get federal charges that Switzerland might actually respect. Joy called me that same afternoon crying because she'd found a key hidden in Ruby's old teddy bear that opened a safety deposit box at Wells Fargo. And when we went together to open it, we found USB drives, notebooks, and photos documenting every single drug deal Ruby had made over 2 years, including detailed notes about how she controlled each person and what threats worked best on them. The evidence was so organized it looked like Ruby had been planning to write a book about it or something, with dates and amounts and even recordings of her threatening kids if they tried to quit buying from her. Agent Morrison took everything and said Ruby had generated over $200,000 selling drugs to minors across 3 states, and she'd been moving the money into cryptocurrency accounts even while in rehab using fake identities she'd set up months ago. 2 months passed before I finally went back to school full-time, but I couldn't focus on anything because every hallway reminded me of walking with Ruby and Stella between classes, and teachers kept giving me extensions I didn't ask for, while classmates either avoided me completely or whispered that I should have known Ruby was dealing. The day I got back from a particularly bad calc test, Brian called to say they'd found a liver donor for Stella, but the surgery was risky because she was so weak, and when I rushed to the hospital, Stella grabbed my hand as they wheeled her toward the operating room. "Don't let her win," she whispered before the anesthesia took her, and I sat in the waiting room for 8 hours watching Brian and Linda hold each other for the first time in weeks, Linda whispering apologies for blaming him while he said they'd both failed but couldn't fail Stella now. The surgery went well initially, but 10 weeks after Ruby had left for Switzerland, Stella developed a serious infection, and they had to put her in a medically induced coma while her body fought it, and the medical bills passed $300,000, which forced Brian and Linda to file for bankruptcy. Agent Morrison kept building her federal case during those weeks, showing me evidence that Ruby had been investing her drug money in cryptocurrency and moving funds around even from the rehab facility, preparing for when she got back. Joy started seeing a therapist who specialized in family trauma, and during one session I went to for support, Joy admitted she'd known Ruby was dealing for over a year, but was too scared to tell anyone because Ruby had threatened to make her disappear, like she could make anyone disappear. Ruby's parents hired some big shot attorney from Seattle who started sending cease and desist letters to everyone who'd posted about Ruby online, claiming their daughter was being scapegoated for Portland's drug problem, and they managed to get the GoFundMe shut down with all the money returned to donors just when we needed it most for Stella's medical bills. The same week all that happened, I got my early admission acceptance letter to Reed College, but I just sat in my room crying because I couldn't imagine leaving Portland now, and my mom found me holding the letter and said Ruby had stolen my future too, and I shouldn't let her steal anymore. 3 months dragged by while I tried to focus on finishing high school, but kept getting pulled back to the hospital where Stella finally opened her eyes one morning in March. The nurses called it a miracle, but when Linda rushed in crying with relief, Stella just stared at her confused and asked where Ruby was because they were supposed to study together. The doctor explained that the oxygen deprivation during her overdoses had damaged the part of her brain that forms new memories, so she was stuck in a loop thinking it was still October, and Ruby was her best friend. Every single morning, Linda had to explain again why Ruby wasn't there, watching her daughter's face crumple with fresh confusion each time. The same week Stella woke up, detective called to tell me the federal prosecutor had filed the indictment with 63 counts against Ruby, including drug trafficking, extortion, and making those videos of minors. Switzerland agreed to start extradition proceedings, but Ruby's lawyers immediately filed papers claiming she was too mentally fragile from her treatment to travel. I started visiting Stella every day after school, sitting with her while she asked the same questions about why Ruby hadn't texted back and if I thought she was mad about something. The way Ruby built those detailed notebooks about controlling people makes me wonder if she studied psychology or just learned through practice. Those recordings of her threats must have taken so much planning. Did she record every conversation or just certain ones she knew would be useful later? Playing along felt like swallowing glass, but when I tried telling her the truth once, she had a seizure from the stress, so I learned to lie and say Ruby was traveling for college visits. One afternoon, my phone exploded with notifications because Ruby had posted a video from her Swiss rehab facility, sobbing into the camera about being persecuted by jealous people from our hometown. She claimed Stella was the real dealer who set her up to take the fall, and that I orchestrated everything because I was jealous of their friendship. The video got shared thousands of times, and suddenly I had strangers commenting on my social media calling me a liar and saying Ruby was clearly the real victim. Detective and the federal agent worked together to freeze Ruby's cryptocurrency accounts the next week, finding over $400,000 spread across different wallets. Ruby's lawyer immediately released a statement saying the money came from legitimate online tutoring and business ventures, starting a whole legal battle over whether they could seize the assets. I was leaving the hospital after visiting Stella when Joy called me crying so hard I could barely understand her. I drove straight to their house and found her in the bathroom with an empty pill bottle, her suicide note on the counter saying she couldn't live with being Ruby's sister anymore. The paramedics got there in time to pump her stomach while she begged me to let her die rather than face Ruby coming back. Brian quit his job at the bank to become Stella's full-time caregiver after Linda had a breakdown, trying to handle the daily heartbreak of explaining Ruby's absence over and over. He learned all the routines that kept Stella calm, the stories that made her happy, the specific lies about Ruby being busy with college college applications that kept her from getting agitated. The whole town started taking sides as Ruby kept posting videos from Switzerland claiming innocence. Some parents organized a support group for the victims, while others started a legal defense fund for Ruby, convinced she was being railroaded. Someone spray-painted "liar" across my car in the school parking lot, but I also found flowers on my doorstep with anonymous notes saying they believed me and to stay strong. Fights broke out at school board meetings between parents demanding accountability and others insisting Ruby deserved the presumption of innocence. 4 months after Ruby left for Switzerland, the extradition was finally approved, despite her lawyer's attempts to block it. Her social media filled with goodbye messages from other rehab patients who believed her story about being a political prisoner and victim of small-town jealousy. She posted constantly about her fear of coming home to face false charges, using hashtags about wrongful prosecution and corrupt small-town police. The federal agent called to warn me that Ruby would probably make bail within days of returning, since her parents had already lined up the money and a judge sympathetic to her successful rehabilitation story. We spent hours going over safety plans for all the victims and witnesses, installing security cameras and panic buttons, because nobody knew what Ruby might do once she was free and back in Portland. The worst part came 2 weeks later when Stella suddenly sat up in bed at 3 in the morning and started screaming Ruby's name over and over until her throat went raw. Brian called me and I could hear her in the background shrieking about the pills, about how Ruby gave them to her after her brother died, about wanting to die too so the pain would stop. The doctors at the hospital said these moments of clarity would happen sometimes when her brain fought through the damage, but they were worse than the forgetting because she'd remember everything Ruby did to her and couldn't handle it. She screamed for 6 hours straight until they had to sedate her, and when she woke up she was back to not knowing who anyone was. Linda couldn't take it anymore and started a support group for parents whose kids Ruby had hurt, meeting every Tuesday in the church basement downtown. 12 families showed up to that first meeting, all with stories about their children going from straight A students to trying to kill themselves after Ruby got them hooked on pills and then blackmailed them with videos, or threatened to tell their parents unless they paid her more money. One mom brought her daughter's suicide note that mentioned Ruby by name, saying she couldn't live with what Ruby made her do for drugs. The group grew to 20 families within a month, all of them willing to testify if the case went to trial. Meanwhile, I had to defer college because I couldn't leave Portland with everything falling apart, and my grandmother's $40,000 was gone, completely wasted on Ruby's fake recovery in Switzerland. I got a job at a coffee shop near the courthouse, making minimum wage and trying to save money for Stella's care that insurance wouldn't cover, since they called the brain damage self-inflicted through substance abuse. Every shift I'd make lattes and think about how Ruby was probably planning her next move from that luxury facility, while Stella couldn't remember her own name. 17 weeks after Ruby left for Switzerland, her plane finally landed back in Portland, and the media went crazy. News vans surrounded the airport, and reporters pushed forward trying to get pictures as Ruby came out in a wheelchair looking thin and weak, her parents on either side blocking the cameras while she kept her head down like she was the victim. That night, she posted on social media about surviving institutional abuse and returning home to fight the lies being spread about her, already spinning the story before she even got charged. Joy called me crying after seeing the post, saying Ruby looked different when she got home, not softer from treatment but harder somehow, like someone had taken everything soft out of her and left only sharp edges. Joy and I sat in my car outside Ruby's house the next day watching her unpack, and when Ruby looked out the window she saw us and smiled this cold, dead smile that made Joy grab my hand so hard it hurt. 2 days later at Ruby's arraignment, she rolled into court in that same wheelchair wearing a modest dress and no makeup, looking like a broken little girl while her lawyer argued she was a victim of addiction who'd been scapegoated by the community. The prosecutor laid out 37 charges including distribution, extortion, and causing grievous bodily harm, but Ruby just sat there looking confused and innocent while her parents cried behind her. The judge set bail at $500,000, which seemed like a victory, until Ruby's parents put up their house and retirement savings, and she walked out free that same evening, the wheelchair suddenly unnecessary once the cameras were gone. Within 24 hours, Ruby was already violating her bail conditions by creating fake social media accounts and messaging her victims, offering them forgiveness and healing if they'd just recant their statements and admit they were lying about her. 3 families reported the contact to police with screenshots, but when they brought Ruby back to court, the judge just gave her a warning about following bail conditions, saying he didn't want to punish someone who was clearly struggling with recovery. The federal agent handling the case met me for coffee and admitted that even with all the evidence, Ruby's lawyers were good enough to create reasonable doubt, especially with Ruby's performance as a reformed addict seeking redemption. She warned me that juries love a comeback story, and Ruby was selling hers perfectly, playing the victim while subtly threatening witnesses through intermediaries who couldn't be traced back to her. A week into Ruby being free, Stella had another clear moment and escaped from her house while Linda was in the shower, wandering downtown in her pajamas looking for Ruby to confront her about the pills. Police found her at the bus station asking strangers if they'd seen her best friend who did something bad, but wouldn't tell her what it was. And when they brought her home, she kept saying Ruby's name over and over like it was the only word she remembered. The next morning, Ruby walked into the coffee shop where I worked, ordering a vanilla latte like we were strangers while the security camera recorded everything. When I handed her the drink, she leaned close and whispered that Stella's brain damage was karma for being weak and that I was next on the list for betraying her. My manager had to physically drag her out when I started shaking so hard I dropped an entire tray of drinks, and Ruby smiled the whole time she was being removed, even waving at me through the window as she left. Joy called me 3 days later crying so hard she could barely talk, and said Ruby had cornered her in their kitchen that morning while their parents were at work. Joy had been wearing the tiny recording device the detective gave her hidden under her shirt collar when Ruby grabbed her shoulders and shook her hard enough to leave bruises. Ruby told her sister she knew Joy had been talking to the cops, and if she testified at the trial, she would make her disappear, just like she could make anyone disappear. Joy played me the recording over the phone, and Ruby's voice was ice cold when she said Joy would end up in a ditch if she opened her mouth in court. The detective had Joy email the recording immediately, and within 2 hours, Ruby's bail was revoked for witness intimidation. I watched from across the street as 4 cop cars pulled up to Ruby's house, and officers went inside while her parents stood on the lawn looking confused. Ruby came out in handcuffs screaming that Joy was lying and had edited the recording, but the cops just put her in the back of the patrol car. 3 weeks later, jury selection started, and Ruby's lawyers fought to remove anyone who had teenagers or worked with kids or had any connection to drug problems in their family. Ruby's parents putting up their house and retirement money to bail her out is making me wonder how much they really know about what she did. Do they actually believe she's innocent, or are they just desperate to save their daughter? They wanted older people without kids who might see Ruby as a sweet young girl who made mistakes instead of a predator who destroyed lives. The process took 2 full weeks, with Ruby's team using all their challenges to remove anyone who looked skeptical when they saw her sitting there in her conservative cardigan, looking like she was heading to church. During those weeks, Stella had one of her clear days, and Linda called me to come over because Stella was asking for me. I found her sitting up in bed looking more alert than she had in months, and she grabbed my hand the second I walked in. She remembered everything about what Ruby did to her, and said she wanted to testify to make sure Ruby went to prison, but we both knew her memory problems made that impossible. She started crying and said Ruby was going to win if she couldn't tell the jury what really happened, and I held her while she sobbed that Ruby had stolen her life and now she couldn't even help put her away. The trial started the next Monday, and Ruby walked into court wearing a knee-length skirt and white blouse with her hair in a neat bun, looking younger than her 22 years. Her lawyers painted her as a victim of addiction, who got caught up in something bigger than herself and was being crucified for the failures of the whole community. When the first victim testified about buying pills from Ruby, she started crying right on cue with these perfect tears rolling down her cheeks while she shook her head like she couldn't believe these lies. The prosecutor called 12 different kids who had bought from Ruby, and every single time she cried and looked devastated like her heart was breaking at these false accusations. On day 4, I spent 6 hours on the witness stand, going through every detail of our friendship and the inheritance and finding out what Ruby had done to Stella. Ruby's lawyer kept pushing that I was bitter about being fooled and needed someone to blame for Stella's condition besides myself, since I chose wrong with the money. The whole time, Ruby watched me with completely cold eyes, even while tears streamed down her face for the jury and her hands shook like she was traumatized. On day 7, Joy took the stand, and the prosecutor played the recording of Ruby threatening to make her disappear if she testified. For just a second, Ruby's mask slipped and pure rage flashed across her face before she caught herself and started sobbing harder. Her lawyer argued the recording was taken out of context and that Joy was disturbed and jealous of her older sister's success before everything went wrong. He said Joy had mental health issues and had been hospitalized twice for depression and was an unreliable witness who wanted attention. The prosecution spent day 9 presenting all the financial evidence, including the cryptocurrency accounts and the spreadsheets where Ruby tracked every sale and every customer with notes about how much she could charge each kid. Her lawyer claimed she was keeping track because she wanted to get clean and pay everyone back, and that the money was for her own rehabilitation, not profit. Some of the older jurors nodded like this made sense and looked at Ruby with sympathy, while she sat there looking broken and remorseful. On day 11, they brought Stella to court in a wheelchair, even though she couldn't testify because the prosecutor wanted the jury to see what Ruby had done. Stella was having a clear moment, and when she saw Ruby, she started screaming and calling her a monster who destroyed her brain on purpose. Ruby immediately started crying harder and covering her face like Stella's words were killing her, while her lawyer demanded the jury be removed. The judge sent the jury out while security wheeled Stella away, still screaming that Ruby was evil and had stolen everything from her. Day 12 was closing arguments with the prosecution showing the pattern of calculated cruelty and how Ruby had targeted vulnerable kids and turned them into customers. The defense showed a young girl who got caught up in addiction herself and was being blamed for a community's failure to protect its children. They said Ruby needed treatment, not prison, and that sending her away wouldn't bring back what these families had lost. The jury started deliberating that afternoon, and I sat with Brian and Linda in the courthouse cafeteria while we waited. Nobody talked about the trial or what might happen because there was nothing left to say after 2 weeks of testimony. Linda pulled out her phone and showed me videos she had taken of Stella's good moments over the past months when her brain worked better. There was Stella singing along to her favorite song from high school and painting watercolors of flowers that actually looked pretty good and smiling at butterflies in their backyard. These little fragments of the real Stella were all her parents had left, and Linda kept replaying them over and over while we waited for the jury. The jury came back after 4 hours with guilty on all charges, and Ruby got 25 years in federal prison. The whole courtroom went quiet when they read it, and Ruby just stared straight ahead like she was somewhere else entirely. Joy started crying and ran out while Brian held Linda as she finally let herself break down completely. Over the next few weeks, our whole community started trying to heal from what Ruby had done. The support group Detective had started grew from 12 people to over 40 as more victims came forward wanting to talk about their experiences. Our old high school brought in real drug counselors and started teaching kids about predators who pretend to be friends while slowly destroying your life. They planted a memorial garden behind the gym with a plaque that said it was for everyone affected by the drug crisis, both the ones who died and the ones who survived but would never be the same. A month after sentencing, Stella's brain damage finally stopped getting worse, and the doctor said she was stable enough to move somewhere better. The insurance company finally approved long-term care after Brian threatened to sue them and go to the media about denying coverage for a crime victim. They moved her to this nice facility outside Portland where she could paint and listen to music and have actual windows to look out of. She had more good days than bad ones now, and on the good days she would smile at the butterflies in their garden and sing along to songs from when we were kids. The nurses said she never asked about Ruby anymore, which was probably better for everyone. I started community college that fall because I couldn't afford real university after everything that happened. In my criminal justice class, we studied cases about dealers who targeted vulnerable people, and I sat there taking notes while the professor talked about how predators pick their victims and control them through fake friendship. He didn't know I was living proof of everything he was teaching, and I never told him, but I wrote down every single thing about how to spot these people before they destroy someone you love. 3 months after the trial, Brian called to tell me he and Linda were doing better. They'd started marriage counseling and were visiting Stella together every single day, making new routines that didn't involve fighting about whose fault everything was. Linda started texting me photos of Stella's paintings, which were these wild swirls of color that somehow showed feelings better than words ever could. The art therapist said it was Stella's way of processing everything, even if her brain couldn't make normal memories anymore. I got a job at the crisis hotline downtown, using my experience to help other people going through similar stuff. When callers described friends who were maybe dealing to them while pretending to care, I knew exactly what to look look for and what to tell them. Every shift I wondered if maybe I could save someone else's best friend, even though I couldn't save my own. 6 months after Ruby went to prison, a letter came from her, and I didn't even open it. My therapist said we should burn it together as part of my healing process, and we did it right there in her office while she talked about how refusing to engage with manipulators was taking back your power. The letter turned to ash in the metal trash can, and I watched it disappear, feeling nothing at all. Joy texted me around that time saying she was doing better than anyone expected. She'd joined a support group for people whose family members were criminals and started playing soccer again at her new school where nobody knew who her sister was. She said she thought about Stella every day and sent money when she could to help pay for her care, which was more than Ruby ever did for anyone. On the anniversary of the day I sent Ruby to Switzerland, I went to visit Stella at her facility. She was having one of her clear days where her brain worked better, and when she saw me, her whole face lit up. She took my hand and said, "You tried to save us both, and then, you couldn't have known what she really was." It was the first time she'd forgiven me for choosing wrong, and sitting there holding her hand, I finally started to think maybe I could forgive myself too. A few weeks later, this big envelope came from some law firm saying I'd been awarded a full scholarship to the state university for everything including housing and books. The agent called me later and sort of hinted that it came from the families Ruby had hurt, who got money back from her cryptocurrency accounts after the government seized everything. They wanted something good to come from all the pain she'd caused and figured helping me get an education was better than the money just sitting there. When I started packing for university that August, I found an old photo in my desk drawer from 7th grade detention. It was Ruby and Stella and me all laughing about something stupid, calling ourselves a three-headed monster because we were always together. I kept the photo, but not to remember Ruby or what we used to be. I kept it to remember that Stella and I survived her, that we're still here even if we're different now, that even the best manipulators can't destroy everything no matter how hard they try. Wow, what a ride today. I've honestly been so curious about all the stuff we dug into together. It's been a blast exploring it with you. Like the video, it helps more than you think.